All right, let's dive in. Today we're looking at someone who's been stirring up a lot of talk in education policy, Penny Schwinn. You sent in a whole bunch of articles and research, and they don't exactly paint the prettiest picture of her. Actually, some of what they're saying is pretty strong stuff. We're
Yeah.
talking neoliberal looting, contracts that seem a bit shady,
Yeah.
and even comparisons to colonialism.
Wow.
It's heavy stuff, right?
Yeah.
But that's why we do these deep dives,
Right.
to really dig into it all, get to the core of what people are criticizing,
Yeah,
and see if we can learn something along the way.
definitely.
What do you think?
Yeah, what strikes me is Schwinn's story. It's not really that unique. This
Hmm.
fast climb she's had from Texas to Tennessee, and now there's buzz about her maybe going national.
Uh-huh.
That's something you see a lot with people who are pushing market-driven solutions in education.
Okay, let's break that down for a sec. Market-driven solutions. I think for some people that might sound a little jargony.
Oh, for
Can
sure.
you give us the plain language version?
Absolutely. So basically, it's like taking ideas from the business world and applying them to schools.
Go ahead.
Things like privatization, competition, viewing students as consumers.
Hmm.
This really got going in the 80s with people like Reagan and Thatcher.
Right.
They believed market forces could actually improve education.
So the thinking is that if schools have to compete, it'll raise standards.
Exactly. But the sources you sent in, they argue that this way of thinking often puts profits ahead of what students and teachers actually need. Like, look at that controversial no-bid contract Schwinn had in Tennessee with ClassWallet.
Oh, yeah, that one definitely caught my eye.
Right?
Didn't the cost end up doubling from what they initially budgeted?
It did. In the end, it cost taxpayers $2.5 million a year. And get this, the legislature had to pull money from teacher salaries to cover the overrun.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, to be fair to Schwinn, she did say that the legislature set that initial budget without even talking to her department. And she claimed the real cost was always going to be higher. But still, not having any competitive bidding, that really raised some red flags,
Yeah.
Especially for someone who's all about these market-based solutions.
Right. It just doesn't look good.
Exactly.
And then there's that whole SPDX thing in Texas, right?
Oh, right.
Another no-bid contract, this time for handling all that special education data.
Yeah, that one caused a huge uproar in Texas. They ended up canceling the contract. But here's the thing. That same company, SPDX, they just kept operating in Louisiana.
So they just kind of shifted states.
Exactly. It shows you how these practices can jump from one place to another, even when people push back.
So we're seeing a bit of a pattern here. These no-bid contracts, potential conflicts of interest, costs that keep ballooning.
Right.
It definitely makes you wonder about transparency and accountability, especially with Schwinn being such a big advocate for market-driven education reform,
Yeah, and that's where this idea of neoliberal looting comes into play.
Okay.
It's a strong term, for sure.
Yeah.
But it gets at this idea that these policies can end up taking money away from public schools and funneling it towards private companies without actually making things better for students. Imagine it like this.
Actually, hold on a second. Before you explain that whole connecting neoliberalism to colonialism thing,
Right.
that feels like a pretty big leap. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. Okay. So picture this. You've got a colonial power extracting resources from a colony, right? All for their own gain.
Okay.
Now think of public education as the colony, and those private companies benefiting from these policies, they're like the colonial power.
So instead of shipping out raw materials, they're taking public funds.
You got it. And the argument is that in both situations, the focus is on profit and taking as much as you can, not on the well-being of the community or the system that's being exploited.
Yeah.
Of course, it's complicated, and not everyone's going to agree with this comparison,
Right.
but it's a perspective worth thinking about.
It definitely makes you think. But let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. All this talk about ideology is important. What does it actually mean for the students and teachers on the ground in Tennessee?
Well, one of the sources pointed out a pretty startling statistic.
Okay.
During Schwinn's time as Tennessee's Commissioner of Education, there were more than 250 resignations from the department in just 10 months.
250 people quit.
Yeah. And we're not talking about entry-level positions. These were experienced staff, people with a ton of institutional knowledge walking out the door.
Wow, that's a mass exodus. Any clue what might have driven so many people to leave?
It's tough to say for sure without talking to them directly,
Yeah.
but it definitely points to some serious discontent within the department.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if Schwinn's policies, especially this push towards privatization, might have had something to do with it.
It definitely raises questions about how these policies are affecting the morale and stability of the whole education system.
Yeah.
And what about the students themselves? Are there concerns about how these market-driven reforms might be impacting them?
Oh, there are definitely concerns.
Okay.
Some of the sources highlight worries about titleized schools being underfunded, the schools that mostly serve low-income students.
Right.
There's also anxiety about teachers losing their power, as decisions about curriculum and how to teach are increasingly being made by outside entities.
Instead of by the educators themselves.
Exactly.
Wouldn't that just make the existing inequalities in the system even worse?
That's the fear. If resources keep getting diverted away from public schools and towards these private companies, the gap between those who have and those who don't is only going to widen.
It's a pretty sobering thought. But what I find encouraging is that these sources don't just criticize the current system. They actually point to some different ways of thinking about education. And that's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
There are some really inspiring examples of grassroots movements that are pushing back against this whole neoliberal agenda in education. And they're advocating for approaches that are more equitable and community-centered.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Yeah.
Give us some specifics. What are these groups actually doing differently?
Well, the article mentions organizations like United Teachers Los Angeles and the Journey for Justice Alliance.
Wow.
They've been leading the charge for things like smaller class sizes, curricula that are culturally relevant, and more funding for schools in under-resourced communities. They're also challenging this huge emphasis on standardized testing and competition.
Yeah, which has become so dominant in the current system.
Exactly.
So it's not just about saying no to what's happening now, right?
Sure.
It's about actively building something new.
Exactly. And it sounds like they're having some real success.
That's great to hear.
It shows that change is possible.
Yeah.
But it takes collective action and a willingness to challenge the status quo. It's about communities taking back the power to shape their own educational destinies.
I love that. Taking back the power. Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, those potential conflicts of interest with these private companies. Specifically, the article mentioned Schwinn's ties to TNTP, the organization Michelle Rhee co-founded.
Right.
Can you remind us about that?
Sure. So Michelle Rhee is a big name in the education reform movement,
Okay.
often associated with policies like charter schools and teacher evaluations that are based on student test scores.
Right. I've heard of her.
Now, Schwinn's husband actually worked for TNTP,
Okay.
and there were allegations that this wasn't fully disclosed on her financial disclosure forms.
And didn't she give an $8 million contract to TNTP while she was Tennessee's commissioner?
That's right. And while there's no proof of any wrongdoing, it doesn't look good, It raises those questions again about transparency and whether personal connections might be influencing policy decisions.
It definitely highlights how important it is to scrutinize these relationships.
For sure.
And make sure that public funds are being used responsibly and ethically. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about Schwinn's background, this whole idea of market-driven solutions, some of the controversies during her time in office, and the potential consequences for students and teachers. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to make sure we leave our listener with a sense of hope. Because while these issues are complex and tough, there are people out there fighting for a better future for our schools.
Absolutely, and their work is truly inspiring.
Yeah.
For instance, one of the sources you sent mentioned the Black Lives Matter at School movement.
Oh, wait.
They're doing incredible work to put the experiences and needs of Black students and educators front and center. They're advocating for things like restorative justice practices, culturally relevant curricula, and dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline.
That's so important.
It is. And another source highlighted the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which is a national coalition fighting for fully funded quality public education for everyone.
That's great.
They're organizing protests, rallies, all sorts of direct actions to demand that our schools are treated as the vital public resource they are.
It's really inspiring to see people coming together like that.
It is.
To challenge the way things are and demand better for our children.
Absolutely.
It definitely gives me hope. Because when people unite and raise their voices, real change is possible.
It really is. And it doesn't have to be these huge movements either. There are things that individuals can do right now in their own communities to actually make a difference.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It can feel kind of overwhelming, like where do you even start?
Right. But it doesn't have to be this big, grand gesture. One of the most powerful tools we have is our voice. speaking up at school board meetings, contacting your elected officials, even just having conversations with friends and family about how important public education is, these things can actually have a real impact.
It's about showing up, right? Making it clear that we're paying attention and we care about what's happening in our schools.
Exactly. And there's power in numbers, too. Joining parent-teacher organizations, supporting local education initiatives, even volunteering in classrooms. These are all ways to contribute to a more positive, supportive learning environment.
And we can't forget about elections either. Education is often a key issue, both locally and nationally.
Oh, absolutely.
So making informed choices about the candidates and the policies we support is crucial.
You're right. It's not just about voting for individuals. It's about advocating for policies that really prioritize public education, equity, and the well-being of both students and teachers.
Right. Putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly. Think about things like increasing funding for schools, supporting teacher development, and ensuring that all students have access to high-quality educational opportunities no matter what.
Okay, so we've talked about some big picture actions, but I'm curious, what can parents and educators do on a more personal level, within their own schools and communities to create a better learning environment?
Well, one thing these sources really emphasize is the importance of relationships and fostering a sense of community within schools.
Okay.
Getting to know your child's teachers, attending school events, volunteering in the classroom. These are all ways to create a more connected and supportive atmosphere.
I love that. It's about going beyond just dropping off and picking up your kid from school. It's about being an active presence and showing your kids that you value their education and support their teachers.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of collaboration and shared responsibility. Because when parents, educators, and community members work together, everyone benefits.
Okay, I want to shift gears for a second and talk about something that's been on my mind. We've been discussing these market-driven reforms, but are there any examples of where they've actually worked? I mean, it's easy to focus on the criticisms, right? But is there another side to this story?
That's a great question. And it's important to acknowledge that there are different perspectives on this issue.
Right.
Some people who support market-based reforms argue that they can lead to more innovation and efficiency in education. For example, they often point to charter schools,
Okay.
which operate independently of traditional public school systems,
Right.
and they have more freedom to experiment with different approaches to teaching and learning.
Right. I've heard about charter schools,
Yeah.
but isn't there also a lot of controversy surrounding them?
Oh, absolutely. There are concerns that charter schools can actually worsen segregation and inequality, that they drain resources from traditional public schools, and that they lack accountability. It's a complex issue, and the research on their effectiveness is kind of all over the place.
So it seems like even when we're talking about potential successes, there are always trade-offs and unintended consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to really look at the evidence and consider how these policies might affect everyone involved.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Wow.
I feel like we've uncovered so many layers to this issue. We've talked about the ideology behind market-driven reforms, the specific controversies surrounding Penny Schwinn, the potential consequences for students and teachers, and even explored some alternative visions for education. But, one thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea that education is often framed as a competition. We talk about raising standards, closing the achievement gap, competing in the global economy. It's all about striving to be the best, to come out on top.
Right.
But what if we shifted our focus? What if, instead of viewing education as a race, we saw it as a journey of discovery and growth?
I love that reframing. Because ultimately, education isn't about winning or losing. It's about cultivating curiosity, fostering critical thinking, and empowering individuals to reach their full potential.
It's about creating a love of learning, a thirst for knowledge, a sense of wonder about the world around us. And it's about nurturing those qualities, not just in our children, but in ourselves as well.
Absolutely. Because learning is a lifelong journey. It doesn't end when we graduate from high school or college. It's something we should embrace throughout our lives. And I think that's a beautiful and hopeful idea.
It is. And it makes me think about those alternative visions for education we were discussing earlier, those movements that are pushing for more holistic, community-centered approaches that prioritize collaboration and creativity over competition and standardization.
Right. Those visions remind us that education can be so much more than just memorizing facts and taking tests. It can be a source of joy, of empowerment, of connection. It can be a force for positive change in the world.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. What does education mean to you? What kind of learning environment do you want for yourself, for your children, for your community?
Take a moment to really reflect on that, because your voice matters, your vision matters. And together we can create an education system that truly serves all of us.
You know, through all this talk about Penny Schwinn and what's happening in education, I keep finding myself thinking about how easy it is to get caught up in the big picture stuff like policies and statistics and ideologies.
Yeah.
But really, education is all about people, isn't it? Real people, real lives.
It is. It's about that kid walking into the classroom every morning. Maybe they're excited, maybe a little nervous, but ready to learn.
Yeah.
It's about the teacher who's put their heart and soul into those lesson plans, hoping to spark that love of knowledge.
It's about parents trying to balance work and life, just wanting what's best for their kids.
Yeah.
And it's about communities putting their faith and resources into schools, knowing that education is the key to building a better future.
You're so right. It's crucial to remember those human stories that are behind all the headlines and the policy debates.
And it occurs to me that this whole conversation around education reform, it's often presented as if education is this problem that needs to be solved,
Yeah,
or a system that needs to be fixed.
I see what you mean.
But what if we flip that around?
Mm.
What if we focused on the things that are already working, the amazing things that are happening in classrooms all across the country?
I love that, shifting the perspective. Instead of always looking for what's broken, we can celebrate and highlight what's already thriving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I'm willing to bet that if we really looked closely, we'd find incredible teachers and passionate students
Oh, yeah.
and supportive communities doing amazing things, often in spite of the limitations of the system, not because of it.
You're absolutely right.
There are teachers out there who are creating these magical learning experiences for their students, and students who are questioning the status quo and coming up with brilliant ideas, and parents who are fiercely fighting for their kids' right to a good education.
It's amazing what they do.
And imagine if we took those stories, those successes, and used them as a guide for the future of education. Instead of imposing reforms from the top down, what if we gave those closest to the students, the people on the ground, the power to lead the way?
That's what's so exciting about all these grassroots movements we've been talking about. They're not sitting around waiting for someone else to come fix things. They're taking charge, building the kind of education they believe in.
It's about communities taking back the power to shape their own futures, right? Recognizing that education isn't one size fits all, but a rich mix of different needs, experiences, and dreams.
You know, that brings us right back to that question we asked the listener. What does education mean to you? Because the answer is going to be different for everyone, isn't it?
It might be about learning specific skills, or fostering creativity, or just cultivating that love of learning. Or maybe it's about building a more just and equitable society. But the amazing thing is that we can hold all those visions at the same time.
That's the beauty of it. And when we embrace all those different perspectives, when we really listen to each other's stories and learn from each other's experiences, that's when the real magic happens.
Okay, one last thought before we wrap things up.
Yeah.
And it might be a bit provocative. We spent a lot of time talking about these market-driven solutions in education.
Right.
And their impact.
Yeah.
But what if the real issue here isn't just one particular ideology, but the very structure of our economic system itself?
Whoa, now we're getting into some deep philosophical territory. But it's a question worth asking, for sure.
Yeah.
Can a system that always puts profit first ever truly be aligned with the goals of public education?
That's the question, isn't it? Because if we truly believe that education is a public good, a fundamental right that everyone should have access to, then maybe, just maybe, we need to start rethinking the very foundations of our society.
It's a huge conversation, definitely bigger than what we can cover in this deep dive.
Right.
But it's something to think about, to talk about with your friends and family, your community, because in the end, the future of education is inseparable from the future of our society as a whole.
So, as we come to the end of this deep dive, I want to leave you with a sense of possibility, a reminder that even with all the difficulties and complexities, there's always hope.
There is.
There are people out there fighting for a better future for education, and their work is truly inspiring.
And you can be a part of that change, too.
Yes, you can.
Stay informed, join the conversation, fight for the kind of education you believe in, and most importantly, never stop learning.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new perspectives and maybe even sparked some important conversations.
Hmm.
Remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.